Cuban Missile Crisis was triggered by a series of miscalculations and mistakes that brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of mutual annihilation. The fall of 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy campaigned for president. The seeds of the Cuban crisis were being sown. Kennedy campaigned as a tough, cold warrior, the man who would confront the Russians everywhere in what he called a global battle for survival.
I have strong ideas about the United States, playing a great role in a historic moment, when the cause of freedom is endangered all over the world, when the United States stands as the only sentry at the gate, when we can see the campfires of the enemy burning on distant hills. Looking right at the camera here. Do that again. Take care again, Canyon. Look this way, please.
In a debate with his Republican opponent, Richard Nixon, Kennedy charged that a missile gap had emerged, that America had fallen behind the Russians in the race for nuclear superiority.
I believe the Soviet Union is first in outer space. We may have made more shots, the size of their rocket thrust, and all the rest. You yourself said to Khrushchev, you may be ahead of us in rocket thrust, but we're ahead of you in color television. I think that color television is not as important as rocket thrust.
His counterpart in the crisis was Chairman Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, determined to confront the U.S. on the Cold War battlegrounds, to make his country a superpower second to none and a beacon to revolutionary struggles throughout the world. To Americans, Khrushchev personified the image of the communist menace. Brash, bumptious, threatening.
We live on earth not by the grace of God and not by your grace.
In a provocative speech at the UN, Khrushchev proclaimed his support for what he called wars of national liberation. Cuba was to become a case in point.
Down with colonialism, the sooner we bury it and the deeper the better.
That same day, Khrushchev cemented an alliance with Fidel Castro, a leader of a successful revolution on the island of Cuba and a star prodigy of the socialist movement. Khrushchev promised Castro that the Soviet Union would actively support Cuba, the first such alliance in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba had once been a favorite vacation spot for Americans. Now, allied with the Soviet Union, Castro's Cuba would become the crucible of the newly elected American president.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
January 20th, 1961, Kennedy took office with a strong warning to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. America would not tolerate the spread of communism in America's backyard.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. And let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
Less than 3 months after taking office, Kennedy approved a secret CIA plan begun under President Eisenhower to overthrow Castro's revolution. April 17th, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles, secretly trained and equipped by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast. The CIA expected the invasion to trigger a popular uprising inside Cuba, but they underestimated Castro's strength. There was no uprising, and the invasion was a miserable failure.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan.
I think it was the first thing he ever really lost, and he felt pretty bad. He felt like he wasn't sure that Allen Dulles of the CIA and the Joint Chiefs thought the plan was as good as they told him it was. And he also thought that maybe they believed that a man that had been president less than 3 months could start off with a failure.
Cuba celebrated, but the Bay of Pigs invasion and subsequent attempts to assassinate Castro convinced the Soviets and the Cubans that the U.S. was bent on destroying the revolution. Cuba had become an icon of the superpower conflict.
Premier Khrushchev arrives in Vienna for the first summit meeting with a U.S. president since the ill-starred conference with President Eisenhower in Paris.
2 months later, still smarting from his fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy flew to Vienna for what turned out to be a tense and hostile summit meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. It was their first opportunity to match wits, and both resorted to brinksmanship. Khrushchev threatened to sever Western access to Berlin, the symbol of divided post-war Europe. Kennedy refused to give ground.
Mr. Khrushchev said, if there's any attempt on the part of the West to interfere with these arrangements, there will be war. Well, now in diplomacy, you don't use that word war very often. You talk about the gravest possible consequences or something of that sort. But Kennedy had to look Khrushchev straight in the eye and say, then, Mr. Chairman, there will be war. It's going to be a very cold winter.
Within a few months, the threats made in Vienna took form in Berlin. Khrushchev built a wall dividing the city and tried to limit Western access to it. Americans responded by brandishing their larger and better deployed arsenal of nuclear weapons.
The president and the free world are willing to use nuclear weapons to preserve our position in Berlin, to ensure that the people of Berlin remain free and that we have access to that city.
You would then perhaps use nuclear weapons in connection with the Berlin situation?
Yes, we will use nuclear weapons whenever we feel it necessary to protect our vital interests. Our nuclear stockpile is several times that of the Soviet Union. We will use either tactical weapons or strategic weapons in whatever quantities, wherever, whenever it's necessary to protect this nation and its interests.
Nuclear weapons had become the central tool of superpower diplomacy. During that tense September of 1961, the Soviets tested the largest hydrogen bomb the world had ever seen. But they had only about 6 intercontinental missiles capable of striking the American mainland. The United States had hundreds of nuclear weapons capable of striking the Soviet Union from North America. And the United States also enjoyed a geographical advantage, with weapons based in allied countries much closer to the Soviet Union: Great Britain, Italy, and Turkey. Khrushchev was acutely aware of the U.S. nuclear advantages. With Berlin divided, the immediate crisis there dissipated. But in October 1961, in the Communist Party Congress in Moscow, Khrushchev was chastised by China for being soft in his dealings with the West. With his leadership of the communist world in jeopardy, Khrushchev was afraid to lose Cuba and was looking for a way to prop up his position there. As the Americans had done in Berlin, he decided to do it with nuclear weapons. Khrushchev explained in his tape-recorded memoirs.
While I was on an official visit to Bulgaria, one thought kept hammering away at my brain. What will happen if we lose Cuba? We had to think of some way of confronting America with more than words. The logical answer was missiles. The United States had already surrounded the Soviet Union with its own bomber bases and missiles. We'd be doing nothing more than giving them a little of their own medicine.
The Soviet Union had been shipping oil, agricultural equipment, and technicians to Castro's Cuba for several years. But in the late summer of 1962, Soviet troops and military equipment arrived on the island at an increasing rate. Alexander Alexeyev was Soviet ambassador to Cuba.
It was clear that the United States was preparing to invade Cuba, so he sent in more military supplies. Planes, MiGs, Soviet military advisors, and finally, We and the Cubans decided that in order to avoid a United States invasion, we should supply Cuba with missiles.
Напасть Соединенным Штатам на Кубу, необходимо ввести ракеты.
A nosotros no nos gustaban los cohetes.
We were not too pleased with the missiles, actually.
Si de nuestra defensa exclusiva se hubiese tratado,
If it had been a matter only of our own defense,
nosotros no habríamos aceptado los proyectiles.
we would not have accepted the emplacement of the missiles
No
here.
vaya a pensarse que era
But don't think that this was because we were afraid of the dangers that entailed the emplacement of the missiles here,
sino por la forma en que eso
but rather
dañaría la imagen
because
de la
this would damage the image of the revolution.
Nosotros éramos muy celosos.
And we are very zealous in protecting the image of the revolution throughout the rest of Latin America.
La presencia de los proyectiles
And the presence of the missiles would in fact turn us into a Soviet military base, and that had a high political cost.
alto.
Kennedy and his advisors dreaded the possibility that Cuba would become a Soviet base, but they could not imagine that Khrushchev would install nuclear missiles there. The Soviets had never placed missiles outside their own territory. On the other hand, Kennedy was concerned that the issue of Cuba might hurt the Democrats in the upcoming elections. He drew the line dramatically and forcefully.
If at any time the communist buildup in Cuba were to endanger or interfere with our security in any way, or become an offensive military base of significant capacity for the Soviet Union, then this country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies.
Less than a month later, Kennedy's commitment to act would be tested. On Sunday, October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance plane left Edwards Air Force Base, California, to take high-level photos over western Cuba. In a field near the village of San Cristobal, the photographs clearly showed 30-foot-long, medium-range Soviet nuclear missiles. Although the missiles were not ready to fire, CIA experts predicted they soon would be. The missiles could hit almost half the U.S. mainland, including New York and Washington. Early Tuesday morning, Kennedy was shown the photos by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy.